Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into exactly how a small, tight-knit group of rebellious Russian composers completely broke every academic rule in the book to change music forever. It is a wild story filled with raw talent, bitter rivalries, and literal cheat codes that essentially hacked the musical system of the 19th century.
So here's the central mystery we are unpacking today. We're going to trace the genealogy of a musical idea, starting from a deeply tragic friendship all the way to a worldwide artistic revolution. Because if you really want to understand modern music, you first have to understand the rule breakers who accidentally invented it.
Section 1. Raw Genius and Loyal Master. Let's look at the tragic friendship that started it all. First up, we have Modest Mussorgsky. Now, a lot of myths like to paint him as a drunken postman, but that's really not quite true. He was actually born into absolute aristocratic privilege and trained as an elite guardsman. But after his family lost their wealth, he was forced into the mundane, totally soul-crushing life of a government clerk, which, is a highly relatable 19th century career pivot. He composed using this raw, untamed intuition, but sadly died at just 42 after tragic struggles with alcoholism. Then you have his close friend, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. He was a highly disciplined naval officer who eventually became an elite academic and arguably the greatest master of orchestral coloring in history. When Mussorgsky tragically passed away, he left behind this completely chaotic stack of unfinished, unorchestrated manuscripts. We're talking about incredibly complex pieces like Night on Bald Mountain, which major theaters had literally rejected as unplayable at the time. So, Rimsky-Korsakov stepped in. He spent years meticulously polishing, reharmonizing, and orchestrating these works just so his friend wouldn't be forgotten by history. Now, here's the truly incredible thing about Rimsky-Korsakov's profound loyalty. For decades, critics aggressively accused the polished master of sanitizing Mussorgsky's rugged original works just to fit polite academic standards. But Rimsky-Korsakov knew his friend was the true creative fire. He quietly preserved all the original manuscripts, fiercely defending the raw power of Mussorgsky's absurdist harmony, and openly admitting he was the undisputed genius of their generation. Moving into Section 2, Forging a Russian Sound. It was time for their group, the Mighty Five, to go head-to-head with the musical establishment.
These guys were part of a self-taught radical circle that explicitly wanted to sever all ties with Western European academic rules. They actively rebelled against that polite, cosmopolitan, French-influenced elegance, the kind being championed by conservatory-trained heavyweights like Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. To the Five, conservatory training was basically a dangerous capitulation. They wore their lack of formal training like a badge of honor, championing a raw, vernacular directness inspired by native Russian culture over the elite Europeanized society of St. Petersburg. So, to bypass those rigid German rules they absolutely hated, they built a completely new musical arsenal. They essentially created literal cheat codes. They used the Russian subdominant to create these heavy, static drones that sound exactly like Orthodox church bells. They used 5-note pentatonic scales to completely ignore standard Western chord progressions. They utilized whole tone cells to make things sound really eerie and grotesque. And, maybe most importantly, they popularized the octatonic scale to evoke magic and the occult. Which brings us right to Section 3, the Octatonic Cheat Code, and how they completely broke the rules of tonality. The crucial thing to understand here is what this specific scale actually does to the human ear. You have to think of it less as a melody and more like a mathematical sonic prism. Because it is perfectly symmetric, it completely unmoors the listener from traditional Austro-Germanic tonality. It completely dissolves that usual tension and release, the dominant and tonic relationship, that your ear is naturally trained to expect. And despite sounding incredibly complex and otherworldly, it's actually super simple to build using just 2 rotational modes. You literally just start on a keyboard and alternate between half steps and whole steps. It essentially takes this intimidating, high-level music theory and turns it into a highly visual, totally accessible recipe. Now, prepare to have your mind blown a little bit. Because of this strict geometric symmetry, there are literally only 3 unique collections of this scale in existence. Unlike standard major or minor scales that exist in 12 distinct transpositions, repeating this alternating pattern every 3 minor thirds just loops the scale right back onto itself. When you start playing around with that math, things get wild really fast. Within a single octatonic scale, you can extract 4 different major triads and 4 different minor triads. Composers realized they could stack disparate chords right on top of each other, like playing a C major and an F sharp major triad at the exact same time.
to create bi-tonality. It has this biting, multi-centered sound. This was the magic trick that let them pivot instantly between distant keys, completely blowing the doors off traditional 20th century music. Section 4, Birth of Modern Color. Let's look at how this Russian toolkit rippled outward and practically hacked the 20th century. Probably the most famous inheritor of this toolkit was Igor Stravinsky. As a pupil of Rimsky-Korsakov, Stravinsky absorbed this exact octatonic DNA right alongside Mussorgsky's famously jagged rhythms. He essentially took the polite rules of the conservatory, walked out into the chaotic reality of Russian village life with all its overlapping rhythmic stomping and untrained voices, and weaponized it. He used it to create revolutionary ballets like The Rite of Spring and Petrushka. As the renowned conductor Michael Tilson Thomas points out, Stravinsky treated these musical elements totally differently than anyone before him. He didn't treat folk tunes as polite melodies to be developed intellectually. No, he treated them as visceral, hypnotic building blocks driven purely by raw gut feeling. He stacked these percussive cells and smashed them together bi-tonally, creating what Tilson Thomas famously calls the conceptual ancestor of primitive rock music. Meanwhile, an entirely different, totally unexpected branch of this legacy was taking root all the way over in Italy. During the winters of 1900 and 1902, a young Italian violist named Ottorino Respighi, who was playing in the St. Petersburg Imperial Theater, decided to study under Rimsky-Korsakov, and this cross-cultural collision completely altered his musical DNA forever. Respighi managed to entirely bypass the dominant European trends of his day. He didn't want the heavy developmental machinery and endless intellectual arguments of the Germanic style, like Wagner. And he didn't want the atmospheric floating mist of the French style, like Debussy. Instead, he grafted Russian coloristic brilliance directly onto ancient Italian Renaissance roots. His music became episodic, intensely bright, and built on these hard-edged modal pillars and monumental brass. By merging his love for early Italian music with the octatonic scales and modal tricks of the five, Respighi learned the ultimate lesson from Rimsky-Korsakov. He stopped treating sound as a machine designed for intellectual arguments, and he started treating the orchestra as an expansive, breathing landscape of pure sensory color and light. The orchestra wasn't architecture anymore. It was a prism. And this brings us full circle. Decades later, radical modernists like Stravinsky and Shostakovich would look back way past Rimsky-Korsakov's polished revisions and fiercely champion Mussorgsky's original chaotic manuscripts. They realized that the raw intuition, the abrasive speech-like rhythms, and those wildly unconventional harmonies weren't mistakes at all. They were visionary modernism, sitting there patiently 50 years ahead of its time. So that leaves us with this final thought for our explainer today. When the establishment called Mussorgsky's work unplayable, his best friend had to literally rewrite it just to get it heard by the public. But today, it's that very original abrasive chaos that we celebrate as the pure spark of modern music. It really makes you wonder, how often in our own time do we mistake rule-breaking genius for mere clumsiness?